Remember who runs this town, counselor. We're watching you.
In my 20 years on the bench, I have stared down gang leaders, serial killers, and the city's most dangerous criminals. I have never blinked, but there is a line that no defendant is ever permitted to cross in my courtroom, a boundary that separates the rule of law from the arrogance of power. On a freezing Tuesday morning, the man crossing that line wasn't a criminal in an orange jumpsuit. It was Marcus Miller, the chief of police for this city. He walked into courtroom 3A with a pressed uniform, a chest full of medals, and an attitude that screamed he didn't believe he was a defendant. He believed he owned the place. I have been threatened before. I've heard the screaming curses of the desperate and the vows of revenge from the unhinged. But this was entirely different. This wasn't the outburst of a street criminal. This was the man responsible for law enforcement for 500,000 citizens, standing in the center of the well, looking at me with the cold eyes of a predator, practically telling me without words, "This badge weighs more than your gavel, Judge Boyd." What unfolded over the next 15 minutes wasn't just a trial for assault. It mutated into a battle for survival between the Constitution and corruption, a direct confrontation that sucked the air out of the room and forced me to make a decision that could end my career or save the soul of this city's justice system. Marcus Miller, 55 years old, the sitting chief of police, stood before the bench not for an administrative error, but for severe felony charges, first-degree assault, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. According to the case file resting on my bench, Miller had been caught on security cameras brutally attacking a 19-year-old student. The boy's crime? He dared to film the chief parking illegally. But the horror wasn't just the punch. It was what happened after. Miller had confiscated the victim's phone, smashed it into the asphalt, and ordered his subordinates to wipe the footage from nearby traffic cameras. He thought he had scrubbed the scene clean. He thought the blue uniform and the gold badge on his chest were an impenetrable shield. He was wrong. When the district attorney, who looked physically ill at the prospect of prosecuting the head of the police force, finished reading the indictment, the atmosphere in the courtroom turned solid. My bailiffs, the men and women charged with protecting me, were technically Miller's subordinates. They stood frozen like statues, their eyes darting nervously between me and their boss. The tension didn't come from what had already happened. It came from the anticipation of what was about to happen. When I asked Miller for his plea, guilty or not guilty, he didn't answer immediately. He slowly adjusted his collar, placed both hands on the defense table, leaned forward, and spoke words that no judge in America should ever have to hear. "Judge Boyd," his voice was low, vibrating with authoritative menace. "Before you ask me that question, you need to remember who protects this building at night. You need to remember who answers when you call 911. You are sitting on the high bench, but I am the one who holds the streets. If you continue with this charade, you will realize that accidents can happen to anyone, even judges." The courtroom went deathly silent. The reporters in the back row stopped typing. My court clerk's jaw dropped. This wasn't a defense strategy. This was a declaration of war. Miller wasn't just threatening me. He was threatening the entire judicial system using the very badge society gave him to protect it. In that moment, I realized this case was no longer about a student getting punched. It was about a single question. Who actually rules this city? The law or the man with the gun and the badge? And I knew my next reaction would define the balance of power forever. The silence that followed Miller's threat was heavy, suffocating. It hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The court reporter's hands hovered over her machine, trembling slightly. The district attorney looked down at his table, terrified of making eye contact with the man who controlled the detectives investigating his other cases. Miller stood there, smiling that tight, arrogant smile of a man who has never been told no without consequences. He was testing the structural integrity of my courtroom. He wanted to see if I would crack. He expected me to call a recess, to retreat to my chambers, to bury this under a seal, to protect the reputation of the department. I didn't blink. If I showed fear now, even a flicker, the rule of law in this city would die right here, right now. I slowly turned my gaze to the court reporter. Ms. Jenkins, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor, did you capture that statement clearly? She nodded, pale-faced. Read it back, please. Her voice shook as she read the transcript aloud. If you continue with this charade, you will realize that accidents can happen to anyone, even judges. Thank you, I said, turning my eyes back to Miller. So the record is clear. Chief Miller, you are currently standing before this court as a private citizen charged with felonies. Yet you just utilized your position as the head of law enforcement to imply a threat against a judicial officer. You are attempting to weaponize the police force against the judiciary. Is that an accurate summary of your statement? Miller chuckled. It was a dark, dismissive sound. He took a step closer to the bench, a physical violation of the Wells Protocol. My bailiffs, Deputy Harris and Deputy Gomez, flinched. I saw Harris's hand twitch toward his belt, but he didn't draw. He looked at Miller, his supreme commander, and then at me. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was wondering, if I move against the chief, is my career over? Is my life over? Miller saw it too. He looked at Deputy Harris and gave a subtle, imperceptible nod. A command, stay down. Judge Boyd, Miller said, ignoring my question, you're playing a dangerous game of semantics. I'm not threatening you. I'm educating you on reality. This city holds together because I hold it together. You prosecute me. You humiliate me in public, and the morale of the entire force collapses. Officers stop responding to calls. Chaos ensues. And in that chaos, who knows who gets hurt? I'm offering you a way out. Dismiss the charges for insufficient evidence. Let me go back to work. Let's keep the peace. He wasn't just claiming innocence. He was holding the safety of the entire city hostage. He was claiming that he was too essential to be prosecuted. It was the ultimate expression of narcissism, the belief that he was the law, not merely its servant. I leaned forward, clasping my hands. Mr. Miller, you are laboring under a profound delusion. You seem to believe that your badge grants you ownership of the law. It does not. It grants you stewardship. And when you use that stewardship to break a boy's face and destroy evidence, you are no longer a protector. You are just a criminal in a costume. Miller's face darkened. The veneer of calm politeness vanished, replaced by the raw aggression he usually saved for interrogation rooms. Watch your mouth, he snapped, pointing a finger at me. I have files on everyone in this city, including you, including the mayor. Do not think you are clean enough to fight me. Are you blackmailing this court now? I asked, keeping my tone deceptively calm. First a physical threat, now blackmail. Mr. District Attorney, are you writing this down? The DA swallowed hard but nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Good, I said, because we are done with the arraignment. We are moving directly to the issue of bail and conduct. I picked up my gavel. It felt heavy in my hand, a solid anchor in a room spinning out of control. Marcus Miller, based on the statement you just made on the record, a direct threat to a sitting judge and an admission of intent to manipulate police resources for personal protection, I am finding you in direct criminal contempt of court. Miller laughed. It was loud and jarring. Contempt? You're going to fine me? Go ahead. Send the bill to the department. I'm not fining you, Mr. Miller, I said, locking eyes with him. I am remanding you. Bail is denied. You are going into custody immediately. The air left the room completely. Miller stared at me, processing the words. He looked at his uniform, then at the exits, and finally back at me with a look of pure, unadulterated rage. He turned to my bailiffs. Deputy Harris, Miller barked, his voice booming with the authority of rank. This judge is confused. Escort me to my vehicle. This was the moment, the nightmare scenario, the executive branch giving an order that contradicted the judicial branch. Deputy Harris stood frozen, sweat beaded on his forehead. On one side, the man who signed his paychecks and controlled his future. On the other, the oath he swore to the Constitution. Deputy Harris, I said, my voice dropping an octave, deadly serious. You are an officer of this court. Your duty is to the law, not to a man. If you disobey a direct order from this bench to facilitate the escape of a prisoner, you will join him in a cell. Place the defendant under arrest. Miller turned fully toward Harris, puffing out his chest, the metals clinking. Don't be stupid, son, Miller growled. You know what happens to traitors. Time seemed to warp, stretching that single second into an eternity. Deputy Harris stood at the precipice of his entire life. On one side, the man who controlled the promotions, the shifts, the internal affairs investigations, the man who could make a police officer's life a living hell with a single phone call. On the other side, the law itself, personified by me, demanding he fulfill the oath he swore on a Bible years ago. The courtroom held its breath. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. Harris looked at Chief Miller, whose eyes were boring into him like drill bits. Then he looked at me. I didn't offer him comfort. I didn't offer him reassurance. I offered him a choice: become a guardian of justice or an accomplice to tyranny. Harris closed his eyes for a heartbeat, inhaled sharply, and made his decision. He reached for his belt, not for his gun, but for his handcuffs. Chief, Harris said, his voice trembling but audible, please place your hands behind your back. The sound of those words was like a thunderclap in the silent room. Miller's face went from red to a ghostly, dangerous pale. He couldn't believe it. He literally could not process that his own subordinate was defying him. What did you say to me? Miller whispered, the menace dripping from every syllable. You better think very carefully about your next move, Harris. You have a pension. You have a family. I have an order from the court, sir, Harris said, stepping into Miller's personal space. Turn around. Miller lunged. It wasn't a full attack, but a violent shove meant to assert dominance, to break Harris's resolve physically. Get your hands off me, Miller roared. That was the mistake. That was the spark. Deputy Gomez, who had been watching from the flank, saw the assault on a fellow officer. The hesitation vanished. Instinct took over. Gomez and Harris moved in sync, grabbing Miller's arms. The chief of police, a man who had put thousands of people in chains, fought like a wild animal. He kicked the defense table, sending papers flying. He screamed obscenities that echoed off the mahogany walls. But he was outnumbered. Click. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest noise I have ever heard in courtroom 3A. It was the sound of a god bleeding. It was the sound of a myth shattering. Marcus Miller, the untouchable ruler of the streets, was bent over the defense table, his hands secured behind his back, panting heavily, his face pressed against the wood. Get him up, I ordered. They hauled him to his feet. Miller's uniform was disheveled, his medals crooked. He looked wild, stripped of his dignity not by me, but by his own arrogance. He glared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and hatred. You have started a war, Miller spat, struggling against the grip of his own officers. You have no idea what is coming for you. You think this is over. This is just the beginning. I will burn this courthouse to the ground with you inside it. Add terroristic threats to the charge sheet, I said calmly to the court clerk, whose fingers were flying across her keyboard. And Mr. District Attorney, please note that the defendant just attempted to incite a mutiny and assaulted a court officer in plain view. I leaned over the bench, looking down at the fallen chief. Mr. Miller, you are right about one thing. This is a war, but it is not a war between you and me. It is a war between the law and lawlessness, and you just lost the first battle. You are no longer the chief of police in this room. You are inmate number 4920. Get him out of my sight. As Harris and Gomez dragged him toward the holding cell door, the same door Miller had sent countless men through, Miller didn't stop screaming. He was shouting names, shouting badge numbers, shouting promises of retribution. But as the heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off his voice, the silence rushed back into the room. It was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't fearful. It was stunned. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just witnessed the impossible. I looked at Deputy Harris. He was shaking, adjusting his belt, looking at the door he had just pushed his boss through. He looked terrified. Deputy Harris, I said, my voice softer now. He snapped to attention, looking at me with wide eyes. Yes, Your Honor? You just did the hardest thing you will ever do in your career, I told him. You chose the badge over the man wearing it. The court notes your bravery. Stand tall, Deputy. You are what law enforcement is supposed to look like. Harris nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, Judge. But I knew the danger wasn't over. Miller was in a cell, but his influence wasn't locked up. He had loyalists. He had favors owed. He had secrets. By tonight, the streets would know that the king had been dethroned, and the vacuum of power would be violent. I had to secure the record, and I had to secure the safety of everyone involved before the sun went down. I called an immediate recess. The adrenaline that had kept my hands steady in the courtroom began to recede, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of what I had just done. I had just decapitated the city's law enforcement structure in open court. As I walked back to my chambers, the hallways felt different. Usually they were places of quiet deference. Now they felt like enemy territory. Every uniformed officer I passed looked at me differently. Some looked confused, others looked terrified, but a few, the older ones, the Miller loyalists, looked at me with a hatred so pure it almost scorched the air. I entered my chambers and locked the heavy oak door behind me. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage. I poured a glass of water, my mind racing through the procedural nightmare I had just unleashed. But before I could even take a sip, the red phone on my desk rang. That line was reserved for emergencies. It was the direct line to the mayor's office and the high-ranking city officials. I knew who it was before I picked it up. It wasn't the mayor. It was someone far more dangerous. Chambers, Judge Boyd speaking. You have exactly 10 minutes to fix this, Catherine. The voice was gravel and smoke. It was Thomas O'Malley, the president of the police union. In this city, the mayor cuts ribbons, but O'Malley cuts throats. He was the man who ensured that bad cops stayed employed, that internal affairs files disappeared, and that judges who asked too many questions lost their re-election bids. Good afternoon, Mr. O'Malley, I said, my voice ice cold. I assume you are calling to inquire about the arraignment of inmate 4920? Don't play cute with me, O'Malley growled. You have the chief of police sitting in a holding cell like a common junkie. Do you have any idea what you've done? My phone is blowing up. The night shift is talking about a walkout. If you don't release Marcus Miller on his own recognizance in the next 10 minutes, there won't be a single patrol car on the streets tonight. If a grandmother gets robbed, that's on you. If a house burns down, that's on you. You are creating anarchy. It was the classic leverage play, the blue flu. He was threatening to leave the city defenseless to force my hand. He was using the safety of innocent citizens as a bargaining chip to protect a criminal. Are you finished? I asked. I'm finished when Miller walks out the front door, O'Malley snapped. Fix it. Call it a misunderstanding. Blame it on stress. I don't care. Just release him. I took a slow breath. This was the moment where most judges folded. The political pressure was immense. The blame game would be brutal. But I remembered the face of the 19-year-old boy whose nose Miller had broken. I remembered the arrogance in Miller's eyes. Mr. O'Malley, I said, leaning into the receiver, let me be crystal clear. You are currently attempting to intimidate a judicial officer and influence a pending criminal case. That is a felony. I am putting you on speakerphone, and my clerk is transcribing this conversation. Would you like to repeat your threat about the night shift for the official record? There was silence on the other end. Dead silence. O'Malley knew the game. He knew he had overplayed his hand. He had assumed I was weak. He had assumed I was political. You're making a mistake, Boyd, O'Malley whispered, the menace replacing the bluster. You can't fight the whole department. You have to drive home tonight. You have to live in this city. Who's going to answer when you call 911? I guess I'll take my chances, I said. And Mr. O'Malley, if one single officer fails to report for duty tonight as part of an organized strike, I will issue a subpoena for your union's financial records, and I will hold you personally in contempt for orchestrating a public safety crisis. Do not test me. I am in a mood. I hung up the phone. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer. I had just declared war on the union. The courtroom battle was over, but the political siege had just begun. I looked at the clock. It was 11:45 a.m. The bail hearing was technically over, but I knew Miller's lawyers would be filing emergency motions within the hour. They would try to go over my head. They would try to find a judge who owed them a favor. I needed to secure the prisoner. As long as Miller was in the courthouse holding cell, he was dangerous. He was surrounded by his own men. I needed him moved. I needed him transferred to the county jail outside of the city jurisdiction, somewhere neutral. But to do that, I needed a transport team I could trust. And right now, I didn't know if a single officer in the building would follow my orders. I pressed the intercom button. Deputy Harris, please come to chambers. Alone. Deputy Harris entered my chambers and closed the door softly, but his hand lingered on the knob as if he wanted to turn around and run. He looked pale, his skin sheen with a cold sweat. He had just arrested his boss, the most powerful man in the department, and the gravity of that act was crushing him. Sit down, deputy, I said, gesturing to the chair opposite my desk. I'd rather stand, Your Honor, he replied, his voice tight. We don't have much time. The word is out. The shift commander just radioed. They are recalling all units to the courthouse for a briefing. There are 50 officers in the garage right now, Judge. They aren't leaving. They're blocking the transport lane. It was a blockade, a silent mutiny. O'Malley hadn't been bluffing about the chaos. He was organizing it. They intended to physically prevent Miller from being taken to the county jail. They wanted to keep him in the city's custody, in their jurisdiction, where they could control the paperwork, lose the evidence, and eventually release him through a side door when the press went home. They want a standoff, I said, standing up and buttoning my robe. They want us to blink. If we hand him over to City PD for transport, he'll be home for dinner. I need you to transport him personally. Do not use a police cruiser. Use the sheriff's van. I've already called Sheriff Reynolds. His deputies are waiting at the county line, but they can't come into the city jurisdiction to get him without starting a turf war. You have to get him there. Harris looked at me, his eyes wide. Judge, you want me to drive the chief of police through a blockade of his own officers? They won't let us pass. They will, I said, grabbing my cane, not because I needed it to walk, but because I needed a weapon of authority. Because I'm walking him down with you. We moved quickly, down the private judicial elevator to the holding cells. The air in the basement was damp and smelled of bleach and despair. We found Miller sitting on the metal bench in the holding cell, still in his uniform, though it was rumpled now. He looked up as we approached, and that smug, predatory smile returned. My ride is here, Miller said, standing up and smoothing his pants. I told you, Harris, the boys are upstairs. You're done. Open this door, apologize, and maybe I'll let you keep your pension. Turn around, inmate, Harris said, his voice steadier now that I was standing beside him. He rechecked the handcuffs, tightening them just enough to remind Miller that he was property of the state, not its master. You're making a mistake, Miller chuckled, looking at me. You can't get me out of this building. My men own the exits. What are you going to do? Shoot your way out? Walk, I ordered. We moved toward the loading dock. As the heavy steel doors rolled up, the bright afternoon light flooded the dim garage, blinding us for a moment. When my eyes adjusted, I stopped. Harris stopped. It was a sea of blue. At least 40 uniformed officers stood in the garage. They weren't holding signs. They weren't shouting. They were just standing there, arms crossed, forming a human wall between the holding cell exit and the transport van. It was the most intimidating sight I had ever seen, the silent, organized resistance of the people with the guns. At the front of the line stood Captain Reed, Miller's right-hand man. Miller laughed behind me. See? Game over, Judge. Hand me over to Captain Reed. He'll take it from here. I stepped forward, the sound of my cane clicking sharply on the concrete floor. The echo cut through the garage. I walked straight up to Captain Reed, a man a foot taller than me and 50 pounds heavier. I stopped 2 inches from his chest. Captain, I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room, you are currently obstructing a court order. This prisoner is under the jurisdiction of the court, not the police department. You have 2 choices. You can step aside and let justice proceed, or you can explain to the FBI why you participated in a conspiracy to aid the escape of a felon. Because make no mistake, federal agents are already on their way to review the security footage of this garage. It was a bluff. The FBI wasn't there yet, but Reed didn't know that. He looked at Miller, then at me, then at the camera mounted in the corner of the garage. He saw the resolve in my eyes. He realized that I was willing to burn my entire career to ensure the law held. This isn't right, Judge, Reed muttered, but his confidence wavered. What isn't right, I retorted. is a chief of police assaulting a teenager and thinking the badge makes him a king. Now move your men. That is a direct order. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Then Reed slowly uncrossed his arms. He stepped to the left. It was a small movement, but it broke the line. The other officers, seeing their leader fold, shuffled aside, creating a narrow path to the van. "Harris, move him," I commanded. Harris pushed Miller forward. The chief's face was purple with rage as he was paraded past his own subordinates, none of whom lifted a finger to save him. The myth of his invincibility shattered with every step he took in handcuffs. We reached the van. Harris shoved Miller into the back cage and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. As Harris climbed into the driver's seat and the engine roared to life, I stood alone in the garage, watching the van speed away toward the exit. The officers turned their gaze on me, 40 pairs of eyes filled with resentment. I had won the battle, but I had made myself a target. The transport van was barely out of sight before the machinery of the blue wall shifted gears from physical intimidation to legal warfare. The physical blockade had failed, so now they sent in the suits. By 2 p.m., my courtroom was no longer empty. It was packed to capacity, not with the usual array of public defenders and tired prosecutors, but with the most expensive legal sharks the police union's war chest could buy. Leading the pack was Arthur Sterling. He wasn't a local attorney. He was flown in from the Capitol, a man who didn't defend the innocent. He dismantled the prosecution. He wore a suit that cost more than my bailiff's annual salary and carried himself with the air of a man who had already read the script of how this day would end. "Judge Boyd," Sterling began, standing at the defense table where Miller had stood hours ago. The absence of the chief was palpable, a void that Sterling filled with slick rhetoric. "We are filing an emergency motion for your immediate recusal. You are no longer a neutral arbiter in this matter. You are the alleged victim of the threat my client supposedly made. You cannot be both the judge and the injured party. It is a violation of due process so flagrant it borders on judicial misconduct. It was a trap, a brilliant, calculated trap. If I stayed on the case, every ruling I made would be appealed on the grounds of bias. If I stepped down, the case would be reassigned to the duty judge, who just happened to be Judge Reynolds, a man who played golf with Miller every Sunday and had received heavy campaign contributions from the police union. If I recused myself, Miller would be out on bail by dinner time, and the message to the city would be clear: threaten a judge, get a new judge." The courtroom held its breath. The reporters leaned forward. This was the moment the system usually corrected itself to protect the powerful. This was the exit ramp Miller had bragged about. I looked at Sterling, then at the empty defendant's chair, then at the camera recording the proceedings. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady, "your argument is legally sound in a vacuum. In a normal case, if a defendant threatened a judge, recusal might be appropriate to ensure the appearance of impartiality. But this is not a normal case. This is a calculated attempt to manipulate the judicial roster through intimidation." Sterling tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, the optics—" "I am speaking," I cut him off. "If I recuse myself today, I establish a dangerous precedent. I would be ruling that any defendant in any courtroom can force a change of venue or judge simply by issuing a death threat. I would be handing every criminal in this state a weapon to shop for a judge they prefer. I will not allow this court to be held hostage by the very tactics the defendant is charged with." "Motion denied," I slammed the gavel. "I am retaining jurisdiction. If you believe I am biased, you can take it up with the Court of Appeals after the trial. But until then, Marcus Miller answers to me." Sterling's face tightened. He hadn't expected me to hold the line. He snapped his briefcase shut. "Then, Your Honor, we demand an immediate emergency hearing regarding the conditions of confinement. My client is the chief of police. Placing him in the general population at the county jail is a death sentence. He has put half the men in that facility behind bars. You are actively endangering his life." This was their backup plan. If they couldn't get him out, they wanted him moved to protective custody in a luxury wing, or better yet, house arrest. They wanted to soften the blow, to make his incarceration a vacation. "Mr. Sterling," I replied, leaning over the bench. Your client should have thought about that before he assaulted a teenager and threatened this court. However, the law requires me to ensure his safety, not his comfort. I have already spoken to the warden. Mr. Miller is in administrative segregation. He is in a solitary cell, 23 hours a day. He is safe, but he is not special. He will not receive phone privileges beyond what is constitutionally required. He will not receive outside food. He will experience the exact same system he has administered for 30 years. Sterling looked furious. This is vindictive, Judge. You are punishing him before he has even been tried. I am ensuring that for the first time in his life, Marcus Miller is treated exactly like everyone else, I said. Court is adjourned. I walked off the bench, my head held high, but my hands were trembling again. I knew what Sterling would do next. He wouldn't fight me in the courtroom anymore. He would take the fight to the court of public opinion. By the time I reached my chambers, the news was already breaking. The police union had released a statement. They weren't just defending Miller, they were attacking me. They had dug up a speeding ticket I got 10 years ago. They were spinning a narrative that I was anti-police, an activist judge with a vendetta. My office phone was ringing off the hook. My email inbox was flooding with hate mail. And then my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. It was a picture of my house, taken from the street, taken 5 minutes ago. Below the image was a single line of text, nice place. Would be a shame if the fire department couldn't reach it in time. The war had followed me home. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The picture of my front porch was grainy, taken from a moving vehicle, but the message was crystal clear. They wanted me to feel vulnerable. They wanted me to imagine my house engulfed in flames while the fire trucks, dispatched by the very system I was fighting, mysteriously arrived too late. It was a terrifying threat, but it was also a fatal mistake. Until this moment, the blue wall had operated in the gray areas, legal motions, union strikes, silent intimidation, but sending a death threat to a sitting judge via an electronic device, that wasn't just a state crime, that was a federal felony. They had just handed me the jurisdiction I needed to bypass the corrupt local system entirely. I didn't reply, I didn't delete it, I took a screenshot. Then I dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. Special Agent Vance, FBI Field Office, a voice answered on the second ring. David, it's Catherine Boyd, I said, my voice low. I'm calling in that favor, and I need the Major Crimes Task Force, right now. I've been watching the news, Catherine, Vance said, his tone shifting instantly from casual to operational. I was wondering when you'd call. The Bureau has been monitoring the situation at the courthouse. We just didn't have a predicate act to intervene. It's a local matter. I just got a death threat sent to my personal cell phone, I said. A photo of my home with an implied threat of arson. It's digital evidence of a conspiracy to obstruct justice through violence. I am formally requesting federal protection and an immediate investigation into the police union's leadership under the RICO Act. There was a pause, the sound of typing on the other end. Send me the screenshot, Vance said. Sit tight. Do not leave the building. I can't stay here, David, I replied. If I hide in my chambers, they win. They need to see me walk out that front door. I'm going home. I need you to meet me there. Catherine, that's suicide, Vance argued. If they are willing to burn your house, they are bullies, David. I cut him off. Bullies don't strike when you look them in the eye. They strike when you run. I'll see you at my house in 20 minutes. Bring the cavalry. I hung up. I grabbed my purse and my cane. I walked out of my chambers, past the empty desks of my terrified clerks, and into the elevator. When the doors opened to the lobby, the atmosphere was thick with hostility. Uniformed officers were loitering near the exits, their thumbs hooked in their belts, watching me. I walked past them. I didn't speed up. I didn't look down. I tapped my cane rhythmically on the marble floor, a metronome of defiance. I could feel their eyes on my back, measuring me, hating me. I got into my car. As I pulled out of the courthouse garage, a marked police cruiser pulled out behind me. It didn't turn on its lights. It just followed, tailgating me, close enough to be intimidating, far enough to claim it was just patrol. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every intersection felt like a trap. Every red light felt like an opportunity for an accident. The cruiser stayed with me turn for turn. They were escorting me, not to protect me, but to remind me that I was in their territory. I pulled into my driveway. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, the same lawn from the threatening photo. I turned off the engine. The police cruiser pulled up to the curb and idled. The officer inside didn't get out. He just watched. I stepped out of my car. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to walk slowly to my front door. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the window, peering through the blinds. The cruiser was still there, waiting. Then, from the opposite end of the street, 3 black SUVs turned the corner. They didn't have sirens. They didn't have markings. They moved with a predatory grace that the local police cruiser lacked. They pulled up directly in front of my house, boxing the police cruiser in. The doors opened. 6 men and women stepped out wearing windbreakers with 3 yellow letters emblazoned on the back, FBI. Special Agent Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle. He walked up to the police cruiser and tapped on the window. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw the color drain from the young officer's face. Vance pointed down the street. Leave. The officer didn't argue. He didn't call for backup. He put the cruiser in gear and sped away, the tires screeching in his haste. Vance walked up my driveway. I opened the door. You have a lot of enemies, Judge, Vance said, looking at the retreating cruiser. And now I have the evidence to bury them, I replied, holding up my phone. They wanted a war, David. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to give them one. I want subpoenas ready for O'Malley and Captain Reed by 8 a.m. You really want to do this? Vance asked. We can take Miller into federal custody tonight. We can end this quietly. No, I said, looking back toward the courthouse in the distance. Miller broke the law in my city. He threatened my court. I'm going to sentence him in my room. The only way to break the blue wall is to show them it can't protect them from the gavel. Tomorrow, we finish this. The next morning, the sun rose over a courthouse that looked more like a fortress. Federal agents stood at every entrance. The blue wall that had blocked the garage yesterday had evaporated, replaced by the stark black windbreakers of the FBI. The message was clear. The local game was over. The federal government was now watching, and the bullies had retreated to the shadows. Courtroom 3A was packed to capacity, but the atmosphere had shifted. Yesterday it was filled with menacing silence. Today it buzzed with nervous anticipation. The citizens had heard the rumors. They knew a war was being fought, and they wanted to see who was left standing. I took the bench. I didn't look at the gallery. I looked straight at the defense table. Marcus Miller sat there, but the transformation was jarring. Gone was the crisp uniform. Gone were the medals. He was wearing the bright orange jumpsuit of the county jail. Without the costume of authority, he looked smaller, older, just a man. Arthur Sterling stood up, but even his expensive suit seemed to have lost its luster. He knew about the FBI investigation launched overnight. He knew his client was radioactive. Your Honor, Sterling said, his voice subdued. In light of the federal developments, my client wishes to change his plea. A ripple went through the crowd. They wanted to cut a deal. They wanted to save what little pension might be left. They wanted to avoid a public trial that would air every dirty secret of the department. Mr. Miller wishes to plead guilty to the assault charge, Sterling continued, in exchange for the dismissal of the obstruction and terroristic threats charges, with a recommendation for probation. I looked at Miller. For the first time, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the table, defeated. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. The time for negotiation ended when your client threatened to burn down my house. The time for probation ended when he ordered his officers to lay siege to this courthouse. I am rejecting the plea deal. We are proceeding to sentencing on the contempt charges immediately, and I am setting a trial date for the felonies. Sterling looked like he had been slapped. Your Honor, you can't. I can, I interrupted. Mr. Miller, please stand. Miller slowly rose to his feet. The chains around his ankles rattled, a sound that usually signaled the end of freedom for the people he arrested. Now it was his soundtrack. Marcus Miller, I began, speaking not just to him, but to every officer standing in the back of the room. For 30 years, this city gave you a badge. That badge was not a crown. It was a loan. It was a loan of the public's trust, a loan of their authority, given to you with the understanding that you would use it to protect them. Instead, you used it to protect yourself. You used it as a weapon to silence a teenager. You used it as a shield to deflect consequences. And yesterday, you used it to threaten the very Constitution you swore to uphold. You believed that because you enforced the law, you were above it. You believed that justice was something you dispensed to others, not something that applied to you. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Compassion in this courtroom is reserved for those who make mistakes. It is not reserved for those who make war on the system. When a person in power weaponizes that power against the people, leniency is not mercy. It is complicity, and I will not be complicit. On the charge of direct criminal contempt for threatening a judicial officer, I sentence you to the maximum penalty of 6 months. On the charge of obstruction of justice for the blockade in the garage, I am revoking your bond entirely. You will remain in custody until your trial for the assault. And regarding your threat to my home, I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. That matter has been referred to the United States Attorney. You are no longer facing a local judge you can bully. You are facing the federal government. Miller looked up then. The arrogance was gone. In its place was the terrifying realization that his life as he knew it was over. Take him away, I ordered. As the deputies, led by a stoic Deputy Harris, escorted Miller out, nobody shouted. Nobody protested. The blue wall didn't crumble. It simply stepped aside to let justice pass. I watched him go through the side door. The orange jumpsuit disappeared into the shadows. I looked out at the gallery. I saw the young man, the student whose nose had been broken, sitting in the front row. He was crying, not from pain, but from relief. For the first time in his life, he had seen the system work for him, not against him. I picked up my gavel. It felt lighter now. This court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was sharp and final. It was the sound of order returning to chaos. It was the sound of a line being drawn in concrete. I stood up and walked back to my chambers. The FBI agents were still there, but I knew I wouldn't need them for long. The fear was gone. The city knew the truth now. The badge is powerful, yes, but the gavel is final.
Where excuses collapse, lies get exposed, and the truth stands on trial. Real courtroom moments, raw decisions, and unfiltered justice delivered straight from the bench. No filters, no mercy, only facts.